Gods have been a part of Dragon Ball's story ever since the later arcs of the original Dragon Ball, with the introduction of Kami at the end of the King Piccolo arc. And upon his introduction, he immediately sets into the role of a mentor for Goku, helping Goku to be prepared to defeat Piccolo when the time came for them to fight again. And while Kami later briefly battles against Piccolo at the Tenkaichi Budokai, this is an exception to his usual way of acting, as Piccolo was an evil he technically brought onto the world, and he believed he had trained a successor in Goku. And this pretty much set the precedent for how gods would function in the story for the rest of the original manga, as passive, albeit flawed, but still positive mentor figures who helped guide the main cast through the conflicts that they face. We can see this in the Saiyan saga, at the introductions of King Enma/Yema and King Kai. Enma is established as a relatively chill guy who takes a liking to Goku, but remains a passive figure in the story, never getting involved in the main conflicts beyond helping out here and there. And then King Kai fulfills a similar role to Kami, with his being a mentor to Goku, training and guiding him to be able to take care of conflict on his own, where he fulfills a role as a guiding figure for mortals. The flaws that Kami once held, aside from feelings of guilt or doubt, were made for him into King Piccolo, who literally represented the former evils that existed in his heart. While King Kai's flaws are shown to be more comedic, with him simply being lazy, as we see in the Cell arc. Then later, in the Buu saga, we're introduced to the Supreme Kai, who, while initially having a much more active role in the arc and directly helping the main cast in person to fight Buu, are relegated to a similar passive mentor role after this plan completely failed, which they remain for the rest of the arc. Then, in 2013's Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods, we get introduced to Beerus the Destroyer, who, in direct contrast to all the previous gods in the story, is a main antagonist of the movie, rather than a passive mentor that the other gods were. Where past gods were portrayed with flaws or having failings, they were either presented as being remorseful or in a comedic light. With Beerus, while he does have many comedic moments, his flaws, namely his pettiness and anger, directly drive the arc and are portrayed as neither comedic nor sympathetically, as because of this he almost destroys Earth. And given that Beerus' job is to literally be a god of destruction for the cosmic balance of the universe, that would naturally come with an ego. That when he decides something should be destroyed, it will be very difficult to change his mind about it, if he hasn't already erased you by that point. And while Beerus becomes a much more passive figure after the events of this first arc, the failings and flaws of the gods directly drive the arcs of much of the first few acts of Super. While the gods don't play a major role in Resurrection F, as Frieza's the main antagonist there, the following arc with the Universe 6 tournament returns to this point. The entire tournament is driven by the petty grudges that these destroyers have. It again reinforces one of the main points Battle of Gods was making, in showing just how much mortals are at the mercy of these petty gods. Champa and Beerus are forcing these mortals to fight in this tournament at threat of existence erasure due to the petty grudges over food. Both almost even destroy the universes by accident in their bickering among each other, not at all caring for the collateral damage of it all. Albeit, this is portrayed somewhat comedically here. The destroyers being reckless with and bad at their jobs does become a point that gets acknowledged in the next arcs, namely the following arc, the Goku Black arc, which features the rogue Supreme Kai apprentice Zamasu as the main villain. This comes in even greater contrast to previous gods, as while he tries to fulfill the role of the destroyers while being a Supreme Kai, the gods who are meant to be the exact opposites of each other. Zamasu directly calls out the passive role that all the other Kai and gods have played, thinking that this position as passive observers who merely guide mortals isn't enough, and that a direct hand in dealing with mortals would be much more efficient. And he calls out the destroyers too, as they're the ones who are supposed to be wiping out these races that aren't developing properly, but some of them aren't. Instead of doing their jobs, they focus on petty and insignificant things like fighting over food and sleeping. And Zamasu isn't entirely wrong about his assessment of the gods' performance. For instance, Beerus' laziness allowed beings like Frieza and the Saiyans to rampage freely across Universe 7. Where Zamasu went wrong is his ego. Zamasu's lack of humility and absolute sense of justice, along with his disgust of mortals, caused his judgments of mortals to be extremely skewed and clouded. You can compare how when Beerus was proven wrong about his judgment on Earth needing to be destroyed, despite his ego, he was able to happily accept it. Whereas Zamasu, when his believed superiority over mortals in strength is challenged, and he is instead beaten by Goku, he completely loses his mind at this. Zamasu would never have been able to accept that he's wrong or not perfect, which shows how having a strong sense of justice isn't necessarily a good thing if your ego is so great you can't ever see that you're wrong, because then there's no limit to what sins you could commit in your beliefs, as you just deny what you did anything wrong and defend it no matter what. And that's why Zamasu's disdain of mortals with his ego was the worst possible combination. He disliked mortals, but he could never change that stance, because that would mean he would have to admit he was wrong in the first place, which his ego would never allow for him to do. It's shown just how quickly the ego that comes from the position of being a god can get to one's head, especially since it went beyond mortals as well. He took pride in being a god, yet also wiped out every other god he could. Zamasu's ego was so great that he viewed himself as the standard for what all gods should be, and any god that wasn't living up to these standards thus didn't deserve to live. Which is why the only god he didn't kill was just another version of himself. Then the next arc actually brings up these themes again, of both the failings of the Destroyers and the Kai, with Zeno holding the Tournament of Power. His specific motivation for starting the tournament was rather similar to Zamasu. He believed that the gods were not doing their jobs properly, so he decides that the lowest ranking universes who have the least developed mortals should be wiped out. But he spares the universes that had actually developed their mortals well. Like Zamasu, this arc highlights the failures of the gods. Had Beerus not been sleeping or eating all day and actually went and did his job by wiping out races causing trouble for the universe, the mortals of Universe 7 might have actually been able to grow properly. But instead, Beerus allows threats like Frieza and the Saiyans to wipe out countless planets. And the Kai. If they had taken a more hands-on approach to guiding mortals, they might have been able to better teach the mortals of their universe how best to grow. But instead, they acted merely as observers, peeping toms or sleeping instead of actually doing something. And again, in the Tournament of Power arc, it is again a god or gods that are the inciting force for the start of the arc, as it's Zeno holding the tournament, just like in Battle of Gods, Universe 6 in the Black. But at the end of the arc reveals, he's not holding this tournament for petty reasons like Zamasu and Beerus had. He genuinely wants mortals to succeed and prove his judgments wrong, which he is happy to be shown at the end of the arc when 17 revives all the destroyed universes. He's happy. That and the fact we saw him spare the universe that had actually done well show he has a much less clouded judgment of mortals, and is actually a bit smarter than was let on and what everyone thinks of him. So, overall, Super's portrayal of the gods of Dragon Ball give a much more direct, more active role in the conflict and a bit more variety. It all strongly emphasizes the actual downsides and negative traits that one can develop with the power and position of being a god. It really highlights the importance of humility in oneself, especially given the later explanations we get in Super and Daima about the origins of the Kai and Destroyers, are rather telling. None of them were born gods, but were rather chosen for these positions. But that is also a reminder they were once mortals or demons. So their judgments are capable of being wrong, even if they are more enlightened beings, as shown by the likes of Zamasu and Beerus. They are capable of letting these concepts get to their head, to which they either have to be eliminated or be put back on track, which, as I mentioned, really contrasts with how all the gods that were featured in the original 519 chapters were depicted as, like I said, passive figures. In a 2013 interview before the release of Battle of Gods, Toriyama mentioned that for his depictions of gods, he wanted them to feel much like a human, which is why I think you can see in much of his work, gods are rarely portrayed as beacons of perfection or paragons, which I think he does a pretty well job at with all of his work, which is pretty much all I got for this one. Now, if you liked what I had to say here, please do me a favor by liking, sharing, commenting, subscribing, and following me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. There'll be more videos coming soon. Thank you, and have a nice day.